Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the new KZ EDXS. So for those of you who've been around for a long time, you remember the original EDX was probably KZ's first entrance into what I would say is their really budget performance category. You know, high performance, low cost sets. And that one, I think at the time, maybe it started out about $20, eventually made it down to about $5 or $6. I picked up a couple at a very low price. And this one isn't that low, but same kind of concept. This one I think retails for $10 or $11. And again, KZ is shooting for a high performance, low cost set that still has a very nice faceplate on it. That's sort of taking bits and pieces of some of their recent sets. The black shiny faceplate with the cutout metal mesh cutouts, probably decorative mesh there. But yeah, so very nice looking set. You can actually see the dynamic driver through there. But I think EDX and the series of EDX has been something that KZ has been proud about. They always try to pack in a lot of performance at a low cost and try to do that with each set that's actually under that series. So here we are with EDXS. And for those of you who've been following along recently, you'll sort of recognize EDXS, DFI, and ZVX. And if you're trying to compare this to those two sets, it's really not the same. It's a different style tuning, and it sounds quite a bit different. So I know when I first got EDXS, that was my first thought was, well, it's kind of a not quite as good DFI or ZVX. And then when you sort of dig into it, and this is one of those sets where I had quite a few conversations with KZ about what they are trying to accomplish with this one, because it's just a bit different. And I will say yes, it's very much tuned differently than those two. They've actually flipped the 5K, where DFI and ZVX actually dip the 5K, and it makes a very easy listening, more Harman style set. EDXS actually flipped that and made it a peak. And I would say it's tuned differently, and it sounds differently, and it's probably for a different purpose. I don't think KZ has really done a super great job at explaining why they did this, why they changed the tuning, what they are trying to accomplish, but they did. And so that's what I would say about that. So second, this one is, again, it's a $11. I think it is the cheapest Zobel tune set. So their Zobel tuning does sort of move the tuning from standard putting things on nozzles, putting dampers on dynamic drivers, even though you can see both of those there, but move some of the tuning to an electronic circuit, which they're called the Zobel circuit or the Zobel network. And, they contrast that with physical tuning. So at some point they tried to argue that they could do everything in Zobel tuning and have almost no physical means of, no dampeners or mesh filters. But, I think that's just a very hard argument to make. And I think in the past it sounds good on paper, and I understand that they can hit a frequency response that looks good, but to people's ears, I think at least to mine, sometimes it sounds a little raw and a little bit too harsh. It doesn't have that refinement. I think our ears are just used to hearing a tiny bit of dampening to it, a tiny bit of buffering, so you kind of take off that harsh edge. And I'm sure they think, well, we could just put a circuit there, we could have this raw, unfiltered, transparent sound right out of dynamic driver, and I think that is a pretty good marketing thing. I think the reality of it ends up, on a set like this, where you have a peak, and that peak sounds a little more emphasized because there isn't a whole lot of physical tuning, or there's less physical tuning than what they would typically do. So I do think just to be aware with these Zobel sets, some of them have turned out pretty well. Some of them, I think, just have a little harsh edge to it, and I think this is one of those. So the sound, I do think this one does have a heavy emphasis on that presence region, or a heavy emphasis on details, depending on how you look at that region. And the bass isn't that too far behind, so it doesn't sound super bright, but it does sound very colored because of that. And if we look at it, we can kind of see here. So we look at DFI, and DFI, of course, was the switched version. So at the bassiest version of DFI, their bass shells are actually pretty similar. This is all very similar. And like I was talking about, this presence region centered right at 5K with EDXS, they decided to really bump that, put a real emphasis to that, whereas their other sets, ZVX, DFI, they've really dipped that because that's sort of a more mainstream sound. It becomes a little less harsh, less fatiguing. And to put a lot of emphasis right there in that spot, again, I think KZ had a purpose in doing that. They just haven't been clear as to what they were trying to accomplish by doing that. But this little bit does tend to color everything back, and depending on your volume, it does weird things too. But heavy emphasis there, and they actually decreased the emphasis here. So there is a real, sense of this is where the foundation, the center point of this set is, whereas DFI is kind of slid back and you had this really nice, easygoing shape, less fatiguing. Everyone really, really liked DFI. And then when they heard EDXS, it was like, well, this is kind of strange. It's not quite as good. It's kind of a little off balance because of this. And again, I think it's just something that KZ is trying. So where does it work best? And I would say this one does work best at medium and lower volume. And it just sounds more natural. Too much volume gives you too much 5K glare, and that shouldn't be too surprising. And when you combine this 5K glare with the Zobel tuning, I think they just need to match these two and refine how much they can do in Zobel tuning versus having a lot of emphasis on a peak that doesn't sound too emphasized. And again, I will say this isn't really a typical thing for KZ to have a medium to lower volume set. They don't do it all that often, but this one you could certainly hear it. I could almost 100% guarantee that the guy who was tuning this one was not listening to it at too much volume, because as soon as you hit the glare point and turn it down a notch or two, you hear exactly where it should be, where it sounds a lot more natural. Just one click to the right and you hear the glare immediately. So again, KZ was going for something which they didn't really talk about, but yeah, they did something odd there as well. So the bass, not so odd. I think this one is very much typical KZ quality. It's a nice dynamic driver. I think KZ has been kind of zoning in on this same bass shelf that gives them this fun, energetic sub bass, enough mid bass, and it actually pairs well with their dynamic drivers. They don't sound too loose or too bloated. I think they've just been refining this shape and these levels for the past few sets, and I think they are zoning in on levels that do work well with their dynamic drivers that they've been putting out recently. And I think the combination of levels, the performance of dynamic drivers, I think all of that has been meshing really well for KZ. And I think even if you look at random reviews of how they did on recent sets, I think there are a lot less complaints about the bass being too bloaty and loose and not defined than they have in the past. So I do think KZ has been certainly on the right track. And I think, as I said, the KZ has been refining this bass shelf over the past few sets and is pretty much zoning in on something that works well for them. So the mids, and again, I'll say the trick here is volume. Too much volume and it's too colored, and you just have to turn it down a notch or two so it sounds natural. And I don't actually know why they did this. I think you sort of notice that there's a lot of glare, then you turn down, it's a bit natural, and the bass shelf that they use, there's actually still quite enough bass. And again, I think the guy tuning it just hit this magic volume point where it all comes together, where you have enough bass and you have enough natural mids and you get this little emphasis on the 5K. I think he found a point that works well for them, and KZ thought it was interesting. But I do think they had something different in mind with the tuning. It's just very easy to sound off natural with this style tuning, especially if you listen to general music. Does it work better, with some other use like gaming, where that emphasis is useful? I think that's probably what they were going for. When you look at gaming modes on TWS or headphones, and they really emphasize, 2 to 3 all the way out to 7 or 8K, just as a means of where game sound effects might have more detail and presence, and they tend to boost those areas and then kind of dip these out so they are a little non-interfering with the bulk of what people are listening to. I think that there is some use, and KZ was going for something. Dipping this, again, I think had some use that, works well with this and this. Again, there is some method to the madness. They just didn't really explain what was going on or why they did it. So I will say the treble, not shouty. Again, I think the pinna is okay. It's one, again, it's this 10 dB that they've used before on DFI. I think all of this up until this point, what KZ has done recently works well, but that 5K is just a bit much, and then it falls flatter in the air section. So again, not having enough air, but having a big emphasis on 5K, having some bass, I think this combination works well for some things. If you're looking for air, this one is probably a little bit air short for most people, but it would have been hard, even if they had boosted it too much. It would have been hard to hear it over the 5K anyway. So I can't argue too much with what they did there on the upper treble. Again, this tuning is probably going to work well in other uses where that area is a priority, right? Whether you'll get the 5K being a priority or less upper treble, I think there is a method there and a use for it that was what KZ was shooting for. So stage, and I think this is where things go wrong with too much 5K. I think KZ really, really walked the fine line with this one. And when you look at when I was talking about number 2, the Zobel tuning versus the physical tuning of nozzles and dampers and how to get that to sound pleasing and the psychoacoustics of what height sounds like and stage width, I think KZ really, really tried to walk a fine line with this tuning and still do those things, but have this tuning that works for something. And yeah, I think this is just another one of those areas that KZ, it can work on this. You can hear it work, but does it work for everyone and lots of music styles? I think that's where KZ will need to refine that. And I think as far as recent sets, DFI and ZVX, I think EDX is the one that struggled the most with this area and presenting a big open sound with such an emphasis. And the Zobel, I think those were sort of contradicting bits, and KZ just has to work on refining those two parts to get it to the point where both sound better, as opposed to they got the emphasis at the cost of maybe some staging and some height and some volume. So there you go. That's what I got on EDXS. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.